now, from the Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts. Good to have you, Professor. Look, when you came out with your article, everybody said you were barking mad and were probably dangerous. Now, people are sort of saying, well, you might have a point. Actually, strategic price controls could work, but they've been used in Germany, and arguably the latest numbers don't suggest that they have, or at least if they've been effective, they've not been that effective.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I think the contrast between Spain and Germany is actually a really interesting one, because we see in Spain a very ambitious approach to fighting inflation that has included a whole range of measures. So that this is kind of an all-out, all cards on deck approach to fighting inflation. Last year, Spain had higher than European average inflation. And now, as you said, it's the first country that managed to even undershoot the 2% target. So what have they done? They have done things like capping the gas price on the power market to bring down power prices, expanding the group of households that can get government-regulated prices for gas, bringing down the cost of public transportation, making all trains in Spain free throughout this year, introducing a measure that limits the degree by which rents can be increased, so that overall these are targeted measures that try to target some of the most important prices in the CPI that are the most important prices for consumers and also the most important prices for many firms. Being creative and coming up with measures that are starting from the specific institutional structures that they have, rather than coming with some sort of abstractly derived package.
Why do you prefer strategic price controls, for example, as a way to attack greedflation versus a windfall tax afterwards? I suppose a company that knows a windfall tax is going to be imposed is less likely to raise prices accordingly, to put themselves in the ambit of windfall.
Yeah, so to be sure, I'm not using the term greedflation because I feel like it leads to a misunderstanding where we think that there might have been some sudden jump in greed, which I don't think is what we have seen. I'm using the term seller's inflation instead.
Right.
And I'm thinking of it as a process where basically you have these initial very large cost shocks in energy, in raw materials, in shipping, and so on, that then hit the corporate sector as a whole. And what we have seen is that the corporate sector has been quite successful in fending off this cost shock by protecting its profit margins, with some firms being able to also increase profit margins, but the emphasis is here on some. It's not necessarily for all the case, especially in Europe. But overall, this means if you have a gigantic cost shock and the corporate sector isn't paying for it, but is able to transmit the cost shock to consumers, this means that consumers are paying for the cost shock, which is why I am in favor of upstream measures, not necessarily price controls. Things like the strategic petroleum reserve, I think, is a great way of stabilizing oil prices. Price controls are a means of last resort if you don't have any other kinds of shock absorbers for systemically important things like oil, like gas, like power, but they can buy time for measures that correct the supply shortfall and that can kind of reduce this initial shock, which then gives less impetus to firms to increase their prices.
So there will be people like myself of a certain age who sort of hear the word price control and remember sort of the UK in the 1970s with its wage and price control regime across the whole economy. We need to clarify that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about very strategic, not some massive bureaucracy that's going to tell you how much a price of a loaf of bread should cost.
Exactly. I'm not talking about total price controls as the US, for example, had during the Second World War. I'm talking about strategic interventions that, by the way, have to happen when the shock is fresh, right? If you were to go in now, it's of course too late. Energy prices are already coming down. They already have a disinflationary effect. But last year, when the massive shock hit as a result of the Russian war in Ukraine, these kind of measures did have a positive impact. In fact, there has just been a study coming out from the IMF that is also suggesting that such targeted measures in the energy sector in Europe were a rather successful way in contributing to price stability. And we have the European gas price cap, of course, which is a measure that I think is exactly the kind of measure that we need when we are faced with these kind of gigantic mega shocks, really, in essential areas like gas.
Professor, thank you. You very gracefully don't look at everybody and say, "I told you so," as your economic theories have now become more mainstream and adopted. Thank you. I'm very grateful.